Jesus warned his disciples that after he had left the earth and gone to heaven, back where he was before he came, that many false prophets and false teachers would come in after him, deceiving people from the truth. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. Matthew 7:15. Now in context, Jesus is warning his disciples that people will come in with a false gospel after he leaves, and they will come displaying that they are coming with truth, something that is helpful to them. But the real truth is underneath that gospel message that they come with, the false gospel, is a lie. So he's warning people that people like this will come and deceive many people. So Jesus' teaching is found in the New Testament, and he left his apostles in charge of putting down his message for all mankind. That's called the New Testament. And that is where the true gospel is found. So the metaphor is that when Jesus leaves, he has his true teachings he left with his apostles in the New Testament, but others will come in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves, and they will contradict the gospel that Jesus preached and his apostles preached that is found in the New Testament. And this is why it's so dangerous, is these false prophets, these false teachers lead people away from the truth that will set them free, and the only truth that there is out there, that Jesus is Lord, he died for sins of mankind, and that he rose from the dead. When other false prophets come behind him and behind Jesus and contradict that teaching, they are false prophets. So the Bible tells us how to spot these false prophets. This is Matthew 7:16 through 20. Verse 16, you can identify them by their fruit. That is, by the way they act. Verse 17, a good tree produces good fruit, and a bad tree produces bad fruit. Verse 20, yes, just as you can identify a tree by its fruit, so you can identify people by their actions. Now we're going to come back to that verse in a bit, but let's read in 2 Peter chapter 2, where Peter lays out perfectly what a false prophet and a false teacher, what they will look like, and how we can spot them. 2 Peter 2:1 says this, but false prophets also arose among the people. This is talking about in the Old Testament. Just as there will be also false teachers among you who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. So we see in this verse that these destructive heresies will lead people away from Jesus because they will be denying that he is the Lord who bought them. How did he buy them? He died on a cross to pay the price for their sin. So any heresy, destructive heresy that comes in after Jesus, Peter is saying will deny these facts, that Jesus is Lord and that he died for the sins of mankind. You see, Satan is a counterfeiter. He has a false gospel, and it's delivered by false prophets and false teachers, and it makes false converts. And 2 Peter chapter 1 gives us good references for what a true prophet and teacher is supposed to look like. And then in chapter 2, he describes what a false prophet looks like. So let's take a look at a couple of examples and see if Muhammad was a false prophet according to the Bible. So the first test is this. The false prophet will bring a false message from a false source. So the source of his information is false. 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16 says this about true prophets and teachers. For we did not follow cleverly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So Peter says, the apostles have the truth. We're delivering the truth that Jesus left. And this truth is that Jesus Christ is the Lord. And we witness this majesty, that he is God in the flesh. This is our message. And let's see what's the false prophet, what his message is like. This is 2 Peter 2:3. In their greed, these false teachers will exploit you with deceptive words. The long-standing verdict against them remains in force, and their destruction does not sleep. And the story of Muhammad receiving the Quran is very interesting. When Muhammad received words that he says is the Quran, he didn't receive them face to face from Allah. Okay? Muhammad did not hear from Allah in the world. When he was living on the earth, in space and time, he had no direct revelation from Allah at all. His revelation came from a spirit that assaulted him in a cave, and later on, this spirit was given the name Jibril. And so this is the source of his false gospel. Now, his false gospel, it contradicts the true gospel. We see that Peter said the true gospel is Jesus is the Lord, and he died for the sins of mankind. And Muhammad's gospel is the exact opposite, that he is not Lord, and he didn't even die by crucifixion. So his false gospel is coming from a false source. And here's how you know that the Quran is false. It's very simple. Because in the Quran upholds the preservation, the inspiration, and the authority of the gospel in the 7th century that 7th century Christians had with them. So Muhammad told 7th century Christians in Arabia to follow and obey the gospel. And we know from manuscript evidence that the gospel is the same today as it was in the 7th century. The gospel that is found in the Bible is the same gospel that Christians had in the 7th century. And we know this because of the manuscript evidence. And there is no manuscript evidence, by the way, for the Injil that never existed. Some mythological book that Allah supposedly gave to Jesus is not even on the earth anywhere. There's no trace of it. No manuscript evidence. You can't hold it in your hand. You can't read it. Muslims, I'm telling you, where is this book that Allah gave Jesus? Unless you can produce it or produce a manuscript of it or fragments of a manuscript from it, Islam is false. And here's why. Because at the same time, Muhammad confirms the gospel, he contradicts the gospel. He says that Jesus didn't die on a cross, and he didn't rise from the dead, and he's not Lord. And that is the gospel that's found in the Bible and in the 7th century. So we see that either way, the Quran that Muhammad gave is false. Now, either Muhammad made this up, or Muhammad got false revelations from a demon spirit in a cave, or Allah is dumb as a bag of hammers and doesn't know that the gospel he told people to uphold in the 7th century contradicts the true gospel. So all three options you have that Muhammad is a false prophet. So that's strike one for Muhammad. And number two, the false prophet and the false teacher will always have a different message than what Jesus gave and what the apostles gave. 1 Peter 1:3 says this, His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. He's talking about Jesus has divine power. That's only God has divine power. And only Jesus gave them this knowledge of who He was. So let's look at the false prophet. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be also false teachers among you, who will secretly, that means deceptively, sneakily, introduce destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Now in Islam, the worst thing a Muslim can do is confess the truth, that Jesus is Lord. This is built into the system of Islam for a reason, because it's a false gospel that was delivered by a false prophet, a wolf in sheep's clothing, who comes only outwardly to be saying the truth about Jesus, but inwardly it is a lie, and it's destructive, and it destroys people's souls, because when they believe the lie about what Muhammad said about Jesus, it takes them away from the truth that Jesus is Lord, He died for your sin, and He rose from the dead. And modern day Muslim apologists are very sneaky. They say things like, hey, Muslims believe in Jesus too. I've seen this in my comment section over and over and over from Muslims. That why are you picking on us? We believe in Jesus as well. But in truth, they don't believe in the real Jesus. Their Jesus is made up, okay? It's a fairy tale Jesus that never existed, in a book that never existed, the Injil. So there's no trace of that Jesus anywhere. The true Jesus is found in the Bible. But what Muslim apologists do is they'll say things like this.
Shabir Ali. In this segment for Let the Quran Speak, I want to discuss our belief in Jesus, on whom be peace. For Christians, Jesus, on whom be peace, is a very important figure. He is the founder of Christianity. Outside of Christianity, many religions have little to say about Jesus, on whom be peace. And sometimes outside of Christianity, Jesus is actually even criticized. In Islam, by contrast, we have a lot to say about Isa alayhi salam, about Jesus, and nothing negative about him, all in praise of him.
Of course, that's Shabir Ali, and he's just following in his prophet's footsteps of not telling the truth and being deceptive. You see, Jesus himself told people that he was Lord, that he would die for the sins of mankind by crucifixion, and that he would rise from the dead. This is the gospel message that Jesus gave and left his disciples to preach. So that's strike two for Muhammad. So let's give Muhammad one more chance, okay? He's got 2 strikes, right? It only takes 3 strikes for you to be out. So let's take a look at his life. The Bible said again, let's take a look again at what this verse said. You can identify them by their fruit, that is, by the way they act. Verse 20. Yes, just as you can identify a tree by its fruit, so you can identify people by their actions. And remember, a false prophet is judged by his fruit. In other words, his lifestyle, the way he acts, what he says, the way he treats people. Now, maybe Muhammad doesn't fail this test either. Let's just take a look. Here are some of the acts of Muhammad. This is his fruit. Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old child. Muhammad coveted his own son's wife and married her after their divorce. Muhammad attacked peaceful caravans. Muhammad murdered hundreds of Jews. Muhammad used capital punishment on a woman who made fun of him. Muhammad led wars of conquest. Muhammad had sex slaves. Muhammad owned and traded black African slaves. Muhammad used capital punishment in a brutal fashion on a man who left Islam. So that's strike 3 for Muhammad. He's definitely a false prophet, a wolf in sheep's clothing, who has led billions of people away from the truth of who Jesus really is, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, who left his throne in heaven to die for your sin, and he rose from the dead to demonstrate and to prove that he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and his message is also true. So what you need to do, my dear Muslim friends, is realize that Muhammad is a false prophet, and he's led you and others away from the truth. And it's demonstrated by his contradiction of what Jesus taught, what the apostles taught, and it's also demonstrated in his lifestyle. Now, the Quran says that Muhammad was the greatest example of any human that has ever lived. And we just gave a short, brief answer to that assertion that is not true. You're telling me that the greatest example that you could follow is a guy who had sex with a child? This is ludicrous. This is just illogic. It's just evil. It's just crazy. Why people believe that this guy, this false prophet, is beyond me. And I hope and pray that this video has shaken you loose from that false prophet Muhammad. That he's losing his grip on you slowly, day by day. And maybe today is the day that you leave this false prophet, leave his clutches, leave this wolf, because he's leading you astray. He's a false prophet. But Jesus was the true prophet who gave his life as a ransom and rose from the dead. He is Lord. My dear Muslim friend, if you trust in the true Jesus, leave the false prophet behind, you will never regret it.